The member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the International Monetary Agreements Bill of 2013 and to support the comments from the member for Goldstein. Deputy Speaker, this bill actually will see the Australian taxpayer underwrite close to $7 billion worth of funds to the IMF, supposedly as part of a global effort to enhance the financial backstop against further international volatility. Now, Deputy Speaker, this commitment was made back in April 2012. And of course, if we go back to April 2012, that was a time that this government had promised that our budget would be returning to surplus. I think, Deputy Speaker, there was something like about 3 or 4 or 500 separate occasions that this government, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, gave ironclad commitments, come hell or high water, that the budget would be returning to surplus. However, Deputy Speaker, we know that that promise has been broken, that commitment to the Australian people has been dishonoured. And here we see, Deputy Speaker, in this current financial year, a deficit expected of $19.4 billion. And of course, Deputy Speaker, the financial year has not come to a close. So there is a very good chance, Deputy Speaker, by the time we do close the books on this year, come the end of June, we will see that $19.4 billion deficit even higher. So, Deputy Speaker, here we are in Australia. We have the most bizarre and extraordinary spectacle with this bill. Here we are, lading ourselves up with debt, with already five budget deficits in a row, and a sixth and a seventh committed to by this government if they were to be re-elected. And yet, here we are, laden with this debt, and we are going to provide money to an international organisation that produces nothing, and they will then loan this money to even countries that are more irresponsible and have greater debt than what we do. So under this bill, we will actually be borrowing money from countries such as China and lending it to places like Greece, who will use that to pay off the German banks who have financed a generous Greek welfare state. Deputy Speaker, the process and the outcome cannot be good in the end. Deputy Speaker, we need to realise that the only way that these indebted countries can lift themselves up is to ensure that they follow the principles of free markets and property rights and the encouragement of entrepreneurial activity, because that is the only way that they can create the wealth and activity necessary to lift themselves out of their debt crisis and to rein in their reckless spending. So, Deputy Speaker, if we are giving this money, we must demand, or loan this money to the IMF, we must demand greater accountability. Deputy Speaker, and that brings me to one of the loans the IMF is currently negotiating and proposing with Egypt, a $4.8 billion loan which the IMF is currently in negotiation with Egypt. Now, the IMF are currently calling on Egypt to rein back some of their reckless spending and to lift their debt. However, Deputy Speaker, I believe that the IMF should be doing more than this if they are going to hand the Egyptian government $4.8 million. Deputy Speaker, Egypt's current problems evolve around lack of security and lack of protection for their Coptic Christian minority. Deputy Speaker, this is why their tourism sector has collapsed. This is why the country is in such strife. This is why investors are staying away from Egypt and why Egypt now faces such high interest rates on their borrowings. Deputy Speaker, it was only a short few weeks ago, back on the April 4th, which we actually saw in Egypt an attack on the Christian Coptic Church. The head of the Egyptian Coptic community, their main church there in Egypt, came under attack by a gang of rioters. But what was most disturbing, Deputy Speaker, we saw people dressed in Egyptian police uniforms actually joining in and protecting and aiding and abetting those rioters. Now, if the IMF is going to come in and to loan that money to Egypt, one of those demands it must make sure that the Egyptian government provides full protection and greater security for its Coptic Christian minority. Deputy Speaker, otherwise we are not going to see a tragedy evolve in Europe. It is the international pressure to protect the Christian Coptic minority in Egypt is the only way that the Egyptian economy has a future. And that is where the IMF must play a part, and we here in Australia must demand full accountability from the IMF to make sure when these loans are being handed out to these indebted countries, countries that have got themselves into trouble through their reckless spending and through their build-up of debt, to ensure that they take the steps necessary to actually fix their problems, rather than just continue on the way they are going. Deputy Speaker, the Coalition does not oppose this bill, but we say that we here as the Australian Government must assure greater accountability of the spending of these funds.